This video will cover the Unit 2 of Higher Human Biology, which is Physiology and Health. Specifically, it will cover the reproductive system and part of that topic. So the very first part of that is structure and function of the reproductive organs and also the gametes. So first of all, you need to know the what's called the ploidy, or the chromosome complement of a gamete. So gametes are haploid, and they are produced by germline cells. Now those cells are sometimes given another name in questions, and that name is a gamete mother cell. Now those gamete mother cells, or germline cells, are diploid, and they divide by mitosis to produce copies of themselves, or they divide by meiosis to make the haploid gametes. So, it might be stating the obvious, but hopefully you'll know this already, that sperm are the male gametes. Sometimes the male symbol is shown like that. And they're produced in the testes. Now that's basic National 5 knowledge. The same with the eggs, which is National 5 knowledge. These are now called the ovum, or ova, and these are the female ones. And they are produced in the ovaries. So from now on, we'll focus on them being called ovum or ova. And these are female, so they have the female symbol sometimes. Now I'm going to focus on the males first and label the parts of it. And then once I've labeled the parts, I'll state the functions of each. So you'll often get a diagram that looks something like this, and it can be pointing in either direction, so side profile to the left or to the right. Sometimes you'll be shown a front view, so if that was the case, you would have 2 of these structures and 2 of these structures, because they'd be at the front view instead. So I've labelled the penis and the bladder, but you won't need to label them in a diagram. It's just so you know what these parts are, and you can then get used to where other things are in relation to them. So the main structure that you really want to know to be able to label is this one here, which is a testis. Now testis is just a singular word, so it basically means one. So you would have 2 if it was testes. Now the other structure that's shown in this diagram here, this one is what's called the seminal vesicle. And the other one, which is shaded in slightly grey, is what's called the prostate gland. So if we revisit the gametes, sperm are the male gametes that are produced in the testes, so this is where this would occur here. So the seminal vesicle and the prostate glands are not involved in actual sperm production. They produce other things instead. So specifically what they produce is the fluid that the sperm swims in. So these together will do that, both of them collectively will do that. So they produce the fluid that the sperm swim in. Now there are 2 main functions of that. So specifically the functions are to maintain, 1, the mobility. Now mobility means how well they can move. And then 2, the viability. So the condition and how well they can move, and whether they can move fast enough. So viability is how well they can cope, and mobility is how fast they can move. So they maintain the mobility and viability of sperm. Now they do that because that fluid contains 2 things. The fluid contains sugars, which provide energy. So that makes the sperm viable, and it allows them to move and swim. And it also contains enzymes. And those enzymes will maintain what's called the viscosity. Now viscosity is a measurement of how fluid a substance is. So if something was quite viscous, it'd be quite thick. If it's less viscous, it'd be thinner. So that maintains how fluid that fluid actually is, how viscous it is. Okay, so these two structures produce the fluid that the sperm swim in. Now if we focus in on the testis, so plural testes but one singular testis, what you'd see is a structure that looks like this, so a bit bigger now. And this would be the tube that would leave the testis here. Now when you zoom in on this, there's actually a bunch of tubules. Okay, and these are called seminiferous tubules. Now what I'm then going to do is just quickly label them. So one of these tubules is called a seminiferous tubule. And normally what you'll see is a view of it much more zoomed in than that. And that's what I've drawn over here. So that seminiferous tubule would basically be one of these. Okay, so this whole structure here is also a seminiferous tubule. Now you'll see within these seminiferous tubules that there are sperm. Okay, so this seminiferous tubule is the site of sperm production. Now these ones, here these cells, are the germline cells or the gamete mother cells. These are the cells that produce the sperm. So these are the diploid cells that divide by meiosis and produce the haploid sperm. Okay, and then this whole thing here, seminiferous tubules, I'll write the function down, would be the site of sperm production. Now you're able to recognise these because they are tube shaped, okay, and they're circular when you look at them as a section. Now in between these cells you'll find other cells that I've not drawn in yet, and these cells will be scattered or kind of grouped together and look something like this. Now those cells are called the interstitial cells. Inter basically just means in between. So those interstitial cells are in between the seminiferous tubules, and they are the structures that produce testosterone. So one of the male hormones. So that is a site of production of testosterone. Now there are other hormones that you'll need to know for males, but we'll talk about that in the next video. So for now, the main structures you need to know are the structures within the testis, so seminiferous tubules and the interstitial cells, and also out with the testes, the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is show you the female reproductive system and label those structures and functions for you. So females, a lot of the stuff will be revision from National 5 as well. There are parts and two of them, so two of these ovaries. So one it would be an ovary, two would be ovaries. This whole structure here is the uterus. Okay, and that's where the embryo would grow and develop and then eventually become a fetus. This structure here is the oviduct, sometimes known as the fallopian tube, which will then allow the egg or the ovum to travel from the ovary down and along. Now the oviduct is also where sperm meets eggs, okay, and when a sperm meets an egg, fertilization occurs. So the oviduct is the site of fertilization. Okay, we have another structure at the bottom here, which is the cervix, and that's at the opening, the entrance to the uterus, the entrance to the womb. Now, the cervix, you won't need to know what it does, but you will need to know that it contains mucus. Okay, it has mucus that will then close over or somewhat plug that cervix to prevent sperm from entering. That's more related to the next part. This is another structure you have been able to label from National 5. This is the vagina. But again, you won't need to know about that, really. It's just because it will be labelled in a diagram. So within the uterus, you'll need to be able to label another structure. And that structure is the endometrium. The endometrium is just the lining of the womb. And that is what's lost during menstruation, and then built up again across the menstrual cycle. And again, that'll be talked about in the next video. So the endometrium will just be shown as a lining within the uterus. Okay. Now that endometrium, there's a specific function to that. Now it allows for implantation, so it is where that embryo that would be produced following fertilization and then division would then stick in. So that would be where implantation occurs. And that implantation is implantation of the embryo. Okay, so when I zoom in onto an ovary, or towards an ovary, you get a structure that looks much larger. And this whole thing here would just be the zoomed in view. Now, if you look back to the previous part, ovaries will contain the ovum, and that's the site where ovum are then grown and developed, formerly known as eggs. So this would be an immature ovum. So immature. So essentially not developed yet and not ready to be used. And again, this is also an immature ovum. Not ready to be used yet, not ready to be released yet. Now, as the ovum grows and develops, it is surrounded by a structure called a follicle. Okay, now that follicle surrounds that ovum and it produces a hormone. Now, specifically, that hormone is estrogen. And there are 4 female hormones, but we'll talk about those later in the next video. So this produces estrogen, and within that follicle, that is an ovum. And this one will be mature and ready to be released. Now, when that ovum has been released, this process here, being released from a follicle in an ovary, is called ovulation. And again, we'll talk about that in the next video. Now, the follicle that remains, this area here, will then, in the second phase of the menstrual cycle, become a different structure. I'm going to draw that in this diagram just so that you're aware of it. And that structure looks a bit like a strange cloud. And that structure is known as the corpus luteum. Now, the corpus luteum is another structure that produces another hormone. So that hormone it produces is another long named one. It produces what's called progesterone. Okay, so as an overview then, just to remind you, our National 5 part, to remind you, is that fertilization would occur in the oviduct. Sperm would meet an egg, and the nucleus would then fuse of an egg, and nucleus of sperm, and the nucleus of an egg would fuse together and form a zygote. Okay, so the nuclei of each of those would fuse, form a zygote, which would then divide and move along that oviduct and eventually implant. So, to show you how that looks, that would be the ovum that had been released during ovulation. If sperm are present, the sperm would meet the egg, or the ovum, and it would fuse and form a zygote here. Okay, so this would be your zygote. Now your zygote will then divide by mitosis and form a ball of cells. Now with mitosis it would normally divide, make 2, then 4, then 8, etc. But for this I've just shown a bundle. And then what would happen is it would then implant into the endometrium. So that here is implantation. So these are just the structures and the functions at the moment. What I will do in the next video is really tie together what all the hormones do and what the how these relate to what the structures actually do.